Yeah, so right now, Africa is basically being competed over by the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, and then to a lesser extent, the Turks and UAE, and a little bit of Iran. And a lot of it's just unfortunately come down to gold, diamonds, other rare earths and minerals, cobalt, lithium, and especially in the Sahel, there's a lot of cobalt and other important minerals and gold. And the fact that the Russians, through influence operations and the deployment of their PMCs, private military contractors, the Wagner Group, originally named, now it's known as the Africa Corps. The fact that the Russians have been able to basically push out the Americans, the French, and the Europeans out of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and most recently back in May, Chad. Our research team was actually supposed to go to Chad because we were invited by U.S. Special Forces, a 20th group that were stationed in Chad, and we were supposed to visit them. And then, a couple Chadian defense ministers basically like released some memos about wanting the Americans out, which was basically a byproduct of a very small Russian social media influence campaign to get the Americans out, and it worked. And guess what? The French basically just left about a month or two ago, and the French are leaving Senegal. So in a weird way, the Chinese and Russians are basically winning in Africa. Obviously, the Chinese have a base in Djibouti. The Chinese are also working on getting a base somewhere in West Africa. The Russians have multiple bases in Libya at this point. And because of the Russians probably losing their two bases in Syria due to the civil war ending, it sounds like the Russians are going to pivot all their stuff from Syria to Libya, and you have basically Russian mercenaries all over Northern Africa and Central Africa, basically trying to get access to all the minerals and gold, because this has been a way that the Russians have been able to avoid sanctions and basically get the money and minerals they need to keep the war economy going. So I've actually been advocating in a few articles that if the West wants to play ball with the Russians and beat them in Africa, the first thing they need to do is basically come to terms with the fact that the rebels in Libya that are led by General Haftar, the Europeans and the Americans need to make a deal with him so that General Haftar doesn't keep allowing the Russians to have a bunch of bases on his side of the country, which is basically the eastern areas of Libya. But he does control most of Libya, whereas the UN-backed government in Tripoli is basically unable to do anything and only exists because the UN has decided it will exist. If you acknowledge the harsh, cruel ideas of power, General Haftar is essentially won in Libya. So if the U.S. and if Washington and Brussels wants to keep their head in the sand, they can, or they acknowledge that General Haftar runs that. And if you want to push out the Russians, you have to make a better deal with General Haftar. That's all it is. You just have to accept that that the rules-based order is over and that it's all about power now. And so that to me is a worrying trend. Is that these decisions have to be made that go against our values, ethics, and morals, or at least what we thought they were the last 30 years since the Cold War ended. And this always leads me to the fact that we're in Cold War 2.0. It's just the fact that Brussels and Washington and Berlin have decided that it's not Cold War 2.0, but it is. And until you acknowledge you're in Cold War 2.0, you're going to keep losing at the geopolitical level and on the global stage in general.